Hello and welcome back to the Business Chat, Martin. This is the third episode of the BenQ Business Chat, and I wanted to ask you specifically, how do you feel about it being a third of the way through 2021 already?
Yeah, I can't believe we're already essentially through April now. Time's flown again. Seems like the older I get, the faster time goes.
And look, we live in a very fast-paced world, and a topic that we'll get onto today is specifically about that, where how things are getting even faster and more connected. But last time on the BenQ Business Chat, we talked about blended learning. So I wanted to jump across into the corporate world or the business world more specifically today, and talk about hybrid working. So it's obviously something that's really been accelerated. We'll use the word accelerated again, accelerated by the pandemic and throughout 2020. But just for people who may not know or not familiar with the term, what is hybrid working and how does it apply to the Australian market?
I'm not sure if there's a definition for hybrid working, but the way I see it is hybrid working enables employees to adapt to the changing environment we're in. And essentially the way I see it is employees need to be flexible, as do employers, to allow employees to split their working hours between an office environment, a home environment, and an external environment. And depending on the job role, the job function, some employees may be 100% out of the office, some employees may be a smaller percentage, maybe 50-50, it just depends case by case. But really the idea that employees are forced to go into an office or a work environment has changed for many employees, not all, but many.
And obviously, the word hybrid, meaning that that the two sort of being at home or being in the office can work very hand in hand and obviously in harmony with each other. How realistic is it for businesses to have a nice balance between the two?
Yeah, it's completely realistic because hybrid working normally and for most employees and employers delivers a better outcome. Employees are more efficient and they can work better in a hybrid model. So by that, they're real simple things. So traditionally, everybody has a commute to work. It can be short, can be long, but if you don't have to do that commute either to or from work, that time can essentially be spent more productively.
Which sector of the corporate world do you think benefits the most with an integrated hybrid working solution?
Yeah, so of course it's your traditional office space where you have either cubicles, desks, shared working space, something like that. So that's the most obvious advantage, because if you're a worker in a warehouse environment or a repair centre, for example, it's very difficult for you to take that work back home for a warehouse. It's impossible. So your traditional office space where you have a shared workspace or an individual office is the biggest beneficiary of being able to do that. However, having said that, these kinds of workspace needs to be connected to the internet, needs to have relatively new technology to be able to facilitate that.
Have you seen hybrid working develop over the last decade, say? Because we've had very good connection and collaboration technology throughout at least the last decade. Was hybrid working models being used sort of the pre-pandemic era, say pre-2020?
Yeah, so the way I'd classify that is for hybrid working environments, you had examples of very forward-thinking companies who started or who transitioned to that quite some time ago. And I'm specifically referring to high-tech companies or companies that you'd imagine were in Silicon Valley, software companies. Like the obvious examples are Google, Facebook, Twitter, these kinds of corporations or enterprise companies that were suffering because they perhaps couldn't afford at the startup phase to have lavish offices with infrastructure to enable people to work. And so they were kind of forced to do that hybrid model from the get-go. But then they took it one step further as they became more successful, more profitable, let's say. And then they really refined that hybrid work environment to make it work to their advantage.
So I suppose coming on to the next question, it's sort of related to the last about how hybrid working has been implemented in the last decade or so. I mean, how are Australian businesses embracing the hybrid style of working, do you think? I mean, I suppose pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic.
Yeah, I don't know if the word embracing is the right one to use there, because many companies were forced to operate on the hybrid model, whether they liked it or not. And fortunately, in my opinion, the government stepped in and literally forced employers to make sure that employees were given the opportunity to work in a hybrid manner. And so even if companies liked it or didn't like it, they were forced in a way to execute the hybrid model. And the government mandating it meant that they needed to skill up themselves as an employer. They needed to provide the necessary infrastructure to enable that, whether it's simple IT products or whether it's internet connections, mobile connectivity, you name it. There's all different kinds of facets to hybrid working. But as you touched on at the beginning of this chat, the whole process was accelerated. So coming back to your question, I think employers who didn't embrace it at the beginning are hopefully all seeing the benefits of it. In my opinion, then it needs to be a mix between the two, working from home, working in the office. And if employees and employers can get it right, the benefits to productivity, efficiency are pretty clear and obvious to everyone.
Yeah, agreed. Talking about the embrace of, I suppose, of technology and more specifically productivity. So PwC conducted a survey last year about productivity into 2021 and beyond, based on what's been happening in the last couple of years. And the responses showed that the organisations, specifically in the financial sector, were focusing more about increasing their gig-based employee numbers, and adding that throughout the years to come. So how do you think this will change businesses, and specifically talk about increasing outsourcing, and when we're thinking about the more accessibility and the more critical element of hybrid working?
So the gig-based economy, the way I see it, is running hand in hand with hybrid working. Many companies already prior to the pandemic and now are seeing the value of being able to outsource some tasks in their organization. I see the gig-based economy has been kicked off by companies like Uber, who really pioneered the way through this. And it's really an extension of the way that people are working and seeking employment these days. Back in the day, the traditional way would be people would finish their education, then look for employment, they'd find a job, and that would be their job. These days, it's much more common for people to have more than one job. I wouldn't say it's mainstream or it's the norm yet, but for people to be doing two jobs simultaneously, it's something that I see as a trend, and that trend is moving forward. There are negatives and positives to the gig-based economy. For sure, there are uncertainties for employees in terms of remuneration, in terms of stability, in terms of certainty. But that type of drawback also has positives in that it allows a lot of flexibility. And that's not only in terms of the location, whether they're on-site or off-site, but it allows them flexibility to work outside of normal hours. And in a modern world, everybody is very time poor. So being able to work flexibly in that way does have its advantages as well.
Yeah, for sure. And now that it's not so uncommon, it's pretty common practice to just jump on a Zoom call. If you've got someone gig-based or somebody temporary that you log in with, they could be across the other side of the world, they can be in another office within the same city. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I think that accessibility to getting a wider range of employees into the organization, they may not necessarily be employees of that particular company.
So that word you just used then, accessibility, encapsulates everything in a nutshell, because to have access to be able to do that, you need to be enabled to do that. And that starts off at government level, because rules and regulations of employees, employers, needs to adapt and change to that. And for sure, the laws in this country, at least in Australia, are getting to that point, but I wouldn't say they're completely there yet. Then you need the hardware to be able to do it. You need the software to be able to do it, in just as you mentioned, with teleconferencing like Zoom, Skype, or Teams, or whatever Google Meet it is that you're using. And then, of course, you need the hardware to be able to do that as well. And then finally, you need to have the mindset to be able to adapt to that kind of situation. So once you have all those things in place, that enables it. And then the accessibility is getting better and better for all kinds of people to access into that space.
Definitely. Now, you mentioned before about some companies, specifically like Google, for instance, who have been implementing and embracing a hybrid working style for a long time. And now we talked about the report that PwC put out about how companies are specifically going to move into 2021 and beyond to increase their productivity. What do you think specifically that businesses or organizations are doing well when it comes to a remote working style?
Many businesses have figured out that hybrid working is beneficial to them. And to be able to do that, they need to empower their employees to get to that point. And you have many companies who are at different stages for that. I think the best case, or the best example, let's say, for an Australian company would be Atlassian, who have publicly announced that they're going to essentially have a business model where all employees are always working out of an office. And I think they announced recently that they require to physically see an employee in the same office 4 times per year, which is almost never. That's just once a quarter they need to see the employee. And obviously, in their case, they're a software company, so they're technologically ahead of the curve, and their product lends itself the best to that kind of environment, because they don't have a physical product that's warehoused somewhere and it's not being shipped in a box to somewhere. It's the best case, and they're at that end of the spectrum where they can decide that level of working outside of the office is the norm. And then the spectrum goes all the way down to companies who do have a physical product, need a warehouse, and for those employees that are working in the logistics side of the business, well, obviously they're not going to be able to work from home. So that's the way I see it panning out, and some companies are doing really well at it, some companies are not doing so well at it yet, but they'll catch up over time. And as those cultures within those companies change, people and employers will get better and better at doing it.
Now, I know you touched on it right at the end there about what's not going so well. I don't want you to throw anyone under the bus by any means, but inversely, what do you think businesses need to be better at? Not necessarily in general, but maybe like a single focus that really does need to be tweaked quite quickly so that they can move into that hybrid working model.
So there are actually many answers to that question, but I'll just touch on a few. The first one is mental health. I'll just touch on that one because it's very important. Although employers may have a plan and they may have a strategy to implement this, some employees don't adjust very well and they need help. If you've had a long career of working in an office for a long time and suddenly you're thrust into a position where you have to work from home and suddenly you don't have that direct communication, in terms of a face-to-face ability to see someone and get their assistance, their help, their feedback or whatever, and you're forced to be at home, possibly on your own, then there are certain cases where employees need that support to be able to get through that initial, perhaps even a shock of the new environment. So that's one thing that I see, and employers need to be quite aware of that and need to manage it themselves. But in a more practical sense, let's say, employees need to be trained and helped to use that technology. If you've been working in an office for a long time and you're used to joining meetings that are held around a boardroom table and you don't need to connect electronically to that meeting, then it's quite simple. But if you don't have the know-how and the training to be able to do it, then you're going to struggle. And that creates extra angst and stress that nobody wants or needs. So there's an onus on the employer to make sure that every employee knows how to do remote or hybrid working. And certainly we touch back on enablement. They need to have the hardware and the software to be able to do it. And then once the necessary training is there and done, then it'll fall into place and it'll work. And training can be formal, it can be informal. As you know, there's so many YouTube videos out there to help people to do various jobs. So it's quite doable and very possible, and I don't see too many barriers. But as long as the employer allows time for the employee to get to that point, then it should fall into space. But those are the two aspects which I personally see that everybody needs to get on top of as quickly as possible. And once that happens, then the results, the benefits, the efficiencies will just come naturally.
Yeah, definitely agreed. Really, really great points that you bring up there. To finish off the chat, I usually ask you a curly question, which is, looking into your crystal ball, what do you see as being the future of the hybrid workplace, or maybe just the workspace in general? Will it be hybrid? Will it be more online based, less online based? What do you see being the changes?
Yeah. So there have been many surveys done since the pandemic started. Most of the surveys I've seen all relate to developed countries, whether in Europe, Australia, United States, these kinds of places. And all of the surveys are coming back with data that's showing that employees like and embrace the hybrid working model. So everybody wants to do it, it seems. When I say everybody, I mean the majority of people. So how that'll pan out moving forward is that office spaces will change. There's still a demand for collaborative technologies. We see that ourselves with the products that we're selling, and even customers like Atlassian, they're still buying interactive technology for a meeting room, even though all of their employees are encouraged and in some cases forced to work externally. So the outlay, the design, the use and the concept of the traditional office is going to change. There's no way around that. And that's not only for the workspace, but also for education. So the way that people set up meeting rooms, the products they put in there, the way that desk spaces are laid out, the way that employee contracts are designed, everything will change over time. And the process has just been accelerated through the current circumstances that we're in, but this is the way that I see it developing moving forward.
Definitely, it's a very exciting time. Everything's changing very fast, and we want to all be ahead of the curve. So, Martin, thanks so much for joining me again for another episode of the BenQ Business Chat. As always, thank you to the listeners and the watchers as well on YouTube and LinkedIn. If you'd like to find any more information about BenQ products, they can head over to benq.com.au and head up to the business section there. So thank you again, Martin, and
thanks,
we'll see everybody on the next episode.
See you next month.